Hi everyone, and welcome to 2023 on my channel. I wanted to kickstart the year early as I feel in previous years I've been a bit slow to get going with my content, and so I want to improve this going forward. It's become a habit of mine recently to interweave different types of videos on my channel. This, and a few others, are a kind of essay style video, and I often interweave these videos with more experimental and practical content, which serves actually as the publishing medium for Adenia, an entity I introduced to the world a year ago and am now 13 episodes in, and over the course of that I have covered many things from bioplastics to algae to the creation of biofuels, and in the future there will be much more stuff just like that, as well as other areas of research as I expand the scope of what I want to do with Adenia. Throughout this year I have many more projects to conduct and share with you all, and I have lots of stuff to talk about in regards to sustainability and transitioning into an abundant, free, ecologically sound future, and this video pertains to just that. Regulars of this channel will know that I am an advocate of sustainability and transitioning humanity into a post-scarcity future. For many, this will seem a daunting, if not lofty, if not utterly utopian task, especially considering the current social climate and indeed the changes to the actual climate, among a litany of other issues we currently face. Previously, a couple of years ago, I talked about ways to kickstart changes via small, self-started initiatives that help people become more self-sustaining and can help them decouple from the current economic system. I talked about growing food, sharing, free education, maker groups, that kind of stuff that can get people doing at least something to help themselves, their communities, and change a small bit of the world around them. How effective that video was depends on what the viewers did with that insight. I stand by everything I said in Seeds of Change 2021. I still think it holds up to this day and recommend you go check it out. However, what I'm going to talk about in this video is my view on what is the next logical step, and that is truly thinking hard about how we can get from a world of ecological disaster, of for many either precarious and or meaningless work, of vapid inequality, of course magnified at the global scale, of atomization, I'd even go as far to say of unfreedom to a certain extent. How do we go from all of that to a society, a future of equity, of community, of free will and thinking, and last but certainly not least, of sustainable abundance? For some, the term post-scarcity means unlimited resources are able to meet the needs and desires of limitless numbers of people, as is portrayed in some science fiction. For us in the real world, this is neither attainable at present nor desirable. A post-scarcity society without any checks and balances when it comes to resource use, waste management, and so on, will likely be highly polluting not just to Earth, but if they expand into space, they'll likely pollute there too. There are more realistic, desirable, sustainable forms of what we can call post-scarcity, or at least post-precarity. A term coined by Zeitgeist Movement founder Peter Joseph is a type of post-scarcity known as access abundance. This is less concerned with transcending material scarcity altogether, and instead is a state of abundance of utility, of use value. A central precondition for this kind of arrangement is for society to follow a principle of access over ownership, also known as usufruct. It has other names such as occupancy and use, but the core idea is to completely abolish absentee ownership. That is, in order for someone to own something, they have to be either occupying or using it, like living in a home or hiring a bike, from a local rank for an hour, rather than that bike's utility being wasted all other times simply because it is owned by someone. This doesn't mean someone can just barge into your home and take your toothbrush because you're not using it. It isn't meant to be taken that literally. In fact, that would be violating the principle, because everything inside someone's currently occupied home, which they could lock with a key like most people do nowadays, is their own personal property, because it is part of their home. If you want to design and build an awesome electric scooter or whatever and keep it to yourself, you can do so, unless you voluntarily forfeit it as a gift, which we will get to later. Nevertheless, under a usufruct system, as opposed to strict property ownership, more goods could exist that are held in common by the community, available to use when needed, such as tools, bikes, books, specialist hardware like cameras, and so on. If there is a sudden influx of people in a community who want to, say, do media production and require the cameras to do so, then accessible stock should be adjusted to meet that demand. Now, with the abolition of private property ownership, the abolition of money is also implied. I'll get more into that later, but now, for the sake of this explanation, let's just take it as a given. This raises the question, what about hoarding? If people can just go somewhere and access something for completely free and just take it whenever they need it, why would they return it? This is a mischaracterization of how access might actually work. You see, places where you go to access stuff are more like fancy sheds more than places you go to do your shopping. They're places for storing stuff that anyone can access that is held in common by the community. A communally owned bike rank isn't much more than a convenient parking space for communally accessible bikes. A photography and film hardware library could be just a place where all the accessible cameras, tripods, etc. are stored, and it might be staffed by a couple of people who clean, maintain and repair the equipment. If services such as these are freely available, along with a convenient place to store stuff, that would disincentivize hoarding quite a bit, I imagine. Switching to a system of access would significantly increase resource efficiency, because it would maximize the amount of use a good sees, because that good is shared amongst a greater number of people. If we really wanted to realize access over ownership, a more organized way to do so would be in the form of communal spaces of access. A system of usufruct makes possible things like communally controlled and accessed libraries, workshops, kitchens, makerspaces, although I guess that comes under workshops, places to study, research, work out, etc., or at least more intuitive in the case of public libraries. This arrangement decreases resource scarcity through decreasing overall resource use. The same resources see more hands, not to mention that such a way of doing things could help foster a sense of community as well. But more things need to happen if we are to realise an abundant and sustainable future. The first thing we need to do? Gut the bloat. Because of the pursuit of ever more economic growth by governments, business leaders, etc., growth in the number of jobs and the amount of resources consumed is encouraged, and this has led to jobs and industries that exist mainly to facilitate growth. A big one the American government likes to invest in is the military and the military-industrial complex, because even though there's no positive outcome from the endless production of weapons and military tech, it's production, it's increased economic activity, it's increased profits for defense contractors, it's growth. In this case, forced growth through public giveaways to private hands. However, there is something more insidious, something that more readily impacts our daily lives, that guarantees large corporations profit, that keeps growth happening through increases in consumption. Actually, I lie. It's two things. Firstly, advertising. You need this new thing which you don't actually need. For the past century, and this has only gotten worse in modern times, advertising has lured countless people into buying things they are tricked into believing they need, many even going as far as to go into debt to afford more expensive items. Advertising encourages impulsive consumption, and it is bad for mental, economic, and even physical health in the case of things like fast food. And it's everywhere. In the case of things like tech, for things like phones, computers, peripherals, etc., where people might actually not want to buy a new device every year because it's expensive, advertising becomes less effective over time. However, the tech industry has another trick up its sleeve to keep people consuming and to encourage throwaway culture. This is planned obsolescence. This inherently wasteful practice is where companies will intentionally handicap their product so that it breaks or becomes obsolete earlier than it would naturally. Companies that do this will often deny people the information, resources, and services required to repair the device, instead encouraging the consumer to just buy a new one. Keep on buying the new one, because that's what keeps our profits high. While this is very efficient at generating revenue for businesses, the same efficiency could not be found when it comes to waste management and resource use. In a saner system, instead of having to produce new phones every year, we could produce phones that last half a decade or even longer, are modular, upgradable, repairable, and are designed for disassembly and thus recycling. Again, as I've said with the idea of gifts earlier, I will talk about this more later on. Adding to this economic bloat are industries that's existence hinges on something existing, something that we encounter and use and work for most days of our lives. Money. Entire sectors of the economy, such as banking and finance, insurance, marketing, most lawyers, solicitors, property management, the stock market, crypto, a significant chunk of office jobs, the list goes on, would have no purpose in a world without money, and the physical resources that those industries are reliant on, such as buildings, IT equipment, energy, furnishings, water, data storage, labour, etc., would not need to be spent on or produced for these purposes. Which leads me to the primary way we can slash or completely abolish all of this economic excess that's taking up valuable resources that could be spent elsewhere or conserved. We abolish money. We get rid of the market system altogether and replace it with something better, more resource efficient, something that doesn't require the perpetuation of economic growth on a planet of finite resources, and actually does a better job of equitably distributing resources to people who need them. Money and markets often, in fact, create scarcities in order to drive out prices, in order to make things more sellable. Markets try to solve scarcity with, well, more scarcity. They are incompatible with the kind of resource conservation and efficiencies that would lead to abundance. In a moneyless society, much less resources would need to be spent because the only industries that would exist would be the ones that have actual use value. Agriculture, science, arts, textiles, tech, energy, medicine, materials, construction, engineering, social care, entertainment, education, hospitality, and so on. Real, tangible things. And in the absence of pointless office jobs and jobs that serve industries hinging on money's existence, people would work a lot less simply because there is a lot less work to actually do. There will be a newfound abundance of something truly scarce in our current world. Time. Time for people to rest, pursue their passions and interests. Time to socialise, to work on one's health and well-being. Something else which would come in greater abundance under such circumstances. Something that might get asked at this point is, why would people work at all? Partly because of human curiosity and self-interest. I want something, so I'm going to make it, or I'm going to provide it for people, and I can use that service as well. But also, it's all to do with mutual aid. Mutual aid / gift economics comes from an understanding that humans are reciprocal in nature, often because of self-interest. I'll cover this more in a moment. But first, I want to talk a little bit about how we can be a little more clever in managing our resources, our waste, and how we can be a little bit more sustainable in the long run. Now, we have to kind of think about what we mean by sustainability. All it really means is to be able to do something for an extended period of time without much negative consequence. Now, when we think about going green and saving resources, one of the targets that we currently go for is energy efficiency. Now, energy efficient solutions are all well and good if you have an abundant supply of resources to make them available to everyone. Now, unfortunately, a fair few so-called energy efficient technologies actually use a fair bit of rare resources that we can't just dish out willy-nilly. An example of this is comparing light-emitting diodes to classical incandescent light bulbs. An LED bulb can light up a room with a lot less energy, outputting more lumens, and that sounds all well and good. However, an incandescent bulb is very simple in its construction. It's just a wire in an inert atmosphere that gets juice pumped through it. It's also made of materials that are easily recoverable and recyclable. Incandescent bulbs use tungsten filaments, which tungsten isn't the most common element in the world, but it isn't exactly the rarest either. In contrast, an LED can be made up of, well, tons of different materials, configurations, compositions. Is it a gallium nitride LED? A indium gallium arsenide LED? Is it a aluminium gallium phosphide LED? Or even an oxide LED? There are so many different types of light emitting diodes out there that are used for all different applications, and that makes any potential recovery and recycling of such much more complex. Not to mention that it's soldered to a board, so you have to think about how to recycle that as well. And gallium and indium and all these sorts of other materials are quite rare in comparison. And in fact, there has been recent advances in incandescent technology, believe it or not, where essentially what you can do is the glass that the filament is contained in, you can sputter that with a very, very thin, atom-thick layer of metal, and what that will do is it will reflect some of the heat, some of the infrared radiation back into the filament, thus increasing the incandescence, increasing the efficiency of the bulb. And when that bulb enters the end of its life, the glass component can either be reused if it's intact, or the thin layer of metal that makes a sort of a translucent reflective coating could be chemically etched away, and you'd be left with pure glass, which you could then recycle quite simply for other purposes. And this is an example of the concept of design for disassembly. If you produce something that's easily disassembled or easily separated into its components, that makes something much more recyclable, and so you enable a circular economy for that type of good. So in order to make goods and technology more sustainable, what we've talked about so far is circular economics. Another obvious thing is the adoption of renewables and other green energy sources. However, something else we could do is eliminate some of these technologies that don't really have much use. A term that I've coined is floating kettle syndrome. This is a term I use to describe technologies, or more commonly features of existing technologies that either don't really see much use or have very little purpose and don't really fulfill any particular need, but at the same time consume valuable resources that could be put elsewhere. What use would I have for a kettle that levitates if it still boils water at a reasonable rate, yet costs more resources, or in today's case, more money, then why would I want the levitating kettle for anything more than just a gimmick? It's unnecessary and it's wasteful. For example, do we really need drinks bottles with LEDs embedded in their labels, or do we need to use more memory on a phone to have animated emojis? That's the kind of stuff I'm talking about, although the scope and scale goes way beyond those examples. Moving on, earlier on I mentioned about the notion of gifts and the need to replace the market with something else. I've talked about gift economics, resource management systems, and the collaborative commons previously on my channel, but here I will give a more contextualized, perhaps more polished and refined explanation as to how and why this is the way forward. Resource management systems are computational algorithms that take demand as feedback and use that data to determine the required supply. Previously, I've discussed centralized/community-wide resource management systems, but something more realistic would be distributed single points of feedback. This is where the responsibility for resource management is placed in the hands of producers who would keep track of demand and adjust supply accordingly. This would work well within the collaborative commons/gift economy context because productive power isn't placed in the hands of a few powerful people, but instead in a decentralized and democratic manner. This also eases the task of economic calculation and distribution, rather than having a centralized system that could potentially get things wrong, as such a centralized system would have to manage way more inputs than a simple single point of feedback, where the only feedback that's needed is the data inputs given by the demands of consumers of a particular commons cooperative. Gift economics, in its widest interpretation, is an alternative to markets whereby producers allow others to access their goods and services without the explicit expectation of immediate reciprocation. In essence, mutual aid practiced on an economic scope and scale. Previously, I've talked about gift economics on a microeconomic level, that is, interactions between two individuals or entities. While this will most likely happen in a gift economy, it's important to recognise that an economy is a large entity with multiple sectors that are often difficult to keep track of when it comes to gifts. So, a secondary way a gift economy could function is through the general recognition that people have needs, wants, aspirations, etc., and that on a macroeconomic level, production and provision of services needs to happen in order for those to be fulfilled. For example, person A is a farmer. Person A needs food, but also needs things like healthcare. They also like the music performed by local musicians in their community, namely person B and C. Person A might not have ever met person B or C, or the medical staff at the local GP or hospital, or many other people in their community for that matter. But person A knows that everyone else in that community, including persons B and C, need to be well fed in order to serve their socio-economic functions. And this is the incentive for the farmer to gift away their produce to the wider community without the microeconomic IOU gift interactions that might otherwise happen on a smaller scale. You can refer to this symbiosis between individual actors and the wider community, paired with various types of community infrastructure, as a kind of community ecology. So, on top of access over ownership, resource management systems, gift economics, circular economics, and just plain designing stuff better, what else needs to happen in order for humanity to achieve sustainable abundance? I can think of two things. Firstly, localization of production. Globalized trade is a logistic as well as an ecological problem. Stuff is often produced today in one area and shipped to another to be packed and then shipped perhaps several times before reaching its final destination. This is good for money making in a capitalist market because you can exploit the cheaper labour of less developed countries and sell high in countries with still measly yet much higher pay. This presents a variety of issues, such as stuff having to travel needlessly vast distances in order to get where the good is consumed. This is also bad from a distribution standpoint. It's extremely difficult in a globalized trade system for a producer to calculate or even estimate demand from other areas on the other side of the world. The only solution here, the only one that's really implemented, is to simply overproduce a good in large factories and pray. This creates tons of needless waste that need not be produced if producers had better information about their consumers. Centralized economic models like this are highly inefficient in resource use, and on top of that are a complete ecological disaster. While international/intercontinental freight isn't as much of an emitter as so-called last mile freight, it is still a significant contributor, which could be avoided. In a system of distributed, localized, ideally on-demand production, goods are produced as close to where they are consumed as possible. The need for freight is minimized, or in many cases eliminated, and producers, with the aid of resource management systems, have a much more accurate idea about the needs and wants of the local community population. Some things, like energy, could even be produced on a home scale via microgeneration using various renewable technologies. Localization doesn't mean going back to the Stone Age. In fact, various technologies and techniques make modern production possible in a dense local format, such as vertical urban agriculture, various forms of CNC and other microfabrication technologies, renewables, and various forms of energy storage, and a whole list of others. Along with the distribution advantages of localization, a big additional advantage of localized production and consumption is that waste is much easier to manage, recyclable, and thus valuable resources are easier to recover, and pollution is greatly reduced. Not to mention that in a circular economy, this means that more resources are available in greater abundance, because more waste goes through the cycle being turned back into valuable resources or serving other purposes. But in order for production to be localized, local producers need to be able to freely manufacture goods as well as have free and open access to the information and resources needed in order to produce something new or even reproduce something that has already been created. Aspiring producers need to be able to know, if they so wish, how something is produced with what resources, and to know exactly where to attain said resources and how to work them into the desired product, and then how to disassemble said product back into its components and or constituent resources. They need to have access to the information and resources to go from cradle to cradle. This is where I introduce the concept of open source to the source. This is where anyone, regardless of location, has fully free and open access to the information and resources needed to produce and replicate goods, and on top of that is also the total freedom of people to improve and iterate the good and share any information about said good to other people. Patents and the patent system? Gone, completely ripped up. NDAs? Also gone. This ability for anyone to produce and reproduce goods and acquire the resources needed to produce said goods, as well as having the time to do so in the absence of contemporary employment, means that there will ultimately be more local producers, as the barrier to entry has been eliminated. This will drive the scarcity of locally manufactured goods down significantly, and could even spur innovation through the free sharing of knowledge and ideas, and the potential collaboration between producers. There's a couple of other mentions of things that would substantially bring down scarcity for things like housing, for example, but I plan on making a separate video about that, because that and community design in general is a whole essay/video on its own. Another thing I haven't mentioned is automation, partly because this isn't something we necessarily have to actively implement. As time progresses, automation will naturally happen and continue to get better at doing menial repetitive work, which is what we want to eliminate if we are to ensure everyone an abundance of free time to pursue what they see fit. Now, I will address the gigantic Ice Age mammoth in the room. Some will say, these are all very wonderful ideas, Adam, but how do we actually go about implementing these changes that are needed for a sustainable and abundant future? Previously, I've talked about ways for people to become more self-sufficient and sustaining, and how to help themselves and others decouple from the monetary market system. However, if we are to go beyond that in any way, shape or form, there is only one realistic way for us visionaries to do so. If we have any hope of a transition into a future incorporating the principles I have explained prior, we have to organise. No, I don't mean protesting in the street and probably getting arrested. What I mean is the formation of organisations, networks and other dual power structures that can help mobilise change and serve as alternative outlets people can rely on. A good example of this is a hybrid cooperative. These organisations can take many forms and can provide many different types of goods and services, independent of governments and capital investors. In an access-abundant community ecology with a collaborative commons in full swing, commons cooperatives would be held in common, as the name implies, and would be worked by their members. In a contemporary context, cooperatives are usually either worker or consumer owned, although they are highly flexible in this regard, and there can be many different types. Hybrid cooperatives usually refer to organisations that are controlled partly by its workers and partly by the wider community. Both these parties are also the primary stakeholders in the organisation and can make decisions about how the organisation is run, what changes could be made, and so on. This isn't too dissimilar to a commons cooperative arrangement, and hybrid cooperatives could be said to emulate commons cooperatives in a monetary market economy. Hybrid cooperatives still need to sell things and make money in order to stay afloat. However, if these cooperatives are smart and take measures to make themselves more self-sufficient, for example generating their own energy or owning their premises rather than renting, they can cut prices and perhaps even hand out some goods and provide some services for free if they can make the money back elsewhere. If hybrid cooperatives cut prices or even provide some things for free due to becoming self-sufficient in order to reduce running costs, also factoring in that they don't need to make a profit to pay capital investors, provided they pay their employees adequately, they have the potential to outcompete even capitalist businesses if they are aggressive enough without putting the co-op in danger. This provides a potential vehicle for transitioning away from capitalism primarily, but as a longer-term goal, the market system itself, assuming that is the intention of the cooperative. Something cooperatives can do once established is use their economic power for transitional ends, conducting projects like building prototype villages or towns to simulate a post-scarcity scenario, with these all backed by excess revenue from regular business operations. These all seem like pretty big things, but part of the transition is also projects and organisations that help get things started. Last year, I birthed my brainchild, Adenia, an idea I had for a project, hopefully a cooperative organisation in the future, that combines sustainability research and development with education on how people can make and do more, and the general advocacy of transitioning into a free, equitable and ecologically sound world, incorporating the things I've talked about in this video. I hear ya, it's a tall order, and we don't have that much time with the ecological and geopolitical and socio-economic clocks ticking. But if we are to move to a better future, it's simply what we have to do. Once again, welcome to 2023 on my channel, and boy do we have lots of work to do. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.